in Alabama. But my sleep career began about 15 years ago as a graduate student. I study social influences on sleep health. So this can span from couples relationships, family relationships. I have a study going on right now on school start times in teens and their families. But I also treat or have treated individuals with sleep problems. So before I became a professor, I did much more of this. Now I do this via graduate students. So I train our graduate students on how to diagnose and treat sleep problems. And I'll talk to you more about those in just a moment. So right now I just do that mostly through clinical supervision. But one thing I can tell you is that we're pretty lucky. There are 3 sleep specialists in Alabama, behavioral sleep specialists, I should say, 3 people like me, and 2 of us are in Tuscaloosa. So we're in good hands here. So my objective for today is to give you an overview on what sleep health is. Briefly talk about why we need sleep. You probably already know some answers to that, but I'll talk about what the literature says. How sleep happens. And I think this is necessary for us to understand what happens when we're not getting it, or we want to and we cannot. And then I'm going to close with common sleep issues and the 2 most common sleep disorders. And then my plan is to leave quite a bit of time for you to ask questions in the chat and me to field them. I find that people learn the most from that. So I'm happy to field them. Doesn't mean I'll know the answer to every question, but I'm happy to field questions. So be thinking of those as we go along. Here's some example questions. So these are questions I get all the time. Do I need to give up TV in bed? Should I exercise before bed? Can I sleep with my pets? Those are just a few of the questions that we can answer. Okay, so what is sleep? You'll see here that there's a bunch of squiggly lines. This is, by the way, what measuring sleep brainwaves looks like. The definition of sleep, which is probably kind of silly when you think about it, is repetitive, reversible behavioral state of perceptual disengagement. Don't need to worry about that so much, but that's the definition. What you should take away from this is that it's a complex mix of physiologic and behavioral processes. So when we are asleep, there are all kinds of processes happening in our brain, but there are behavioral indicators too, and that's important. So for example, one of the things that happens when we fall asleep is that we lose muscle tone. So if you've ever been on an airplane, normally we lie down on the floor or in bed or wherever we sleep, so we don't notice it. But if you've ever been on an airplane or in a car ride, hopefully as a passenger, you not driving, you'll notice that your head nods. That is completely normal. And that's something that is universal across most humans. The other thing that we notice is that our eyes are closed, and this is also across humans. So those are the behavioral indications, but as I have in the background here, we also have brainwave indications, and there's only one way to get those right now. So just hold on to that thought. Now, types of sleep. You may have heard of stages, sleep stages. One of the most common stage we already know about is REM. I'll get to that in a second. But we have non-REM stages of sleep and REM. So it's divided into 2. Our non-REM is stages 1 and 2. They are very close to each other. You'll see that in just a second. And then we have stage 3. And I'm highlighting this one particularly because stage 3, non-REM stage 3, is the stage of sleep that is our deepest sleep, our most restorative sleep. So when we talk about deep sleep, that's usually what we mean. It's indicated, if you were to look at the brain waves of it, it's called also slow wave because there are big slow waves in stage 3 sleep. And then we have REM sleep. And I bet you already know about this sleep because most people do. REM stands for rapid eye movement sleep. So that's how our sleep is divided, basically. We have rapid eye movement and non-rapid eye movement. Rapid eye movement sleep is its own stage. And you may know this as the dream stage, and that's pretty accurate. And it's called as such because if you are looking at brainwaves of sleep, it is not like this, but you watch the eyes and the eyes move around a lot. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this because I think this is useful information to know when we're thinking about sleep. On the bottom of this, this graph here, we have hours of sleep. So this is not clock time. It's just in the first hour, the second hour, etc., all the way to 8 hours. And where we get 8 hours is that most people, adults, need about 8 hours. That's not always the case, but that's where we get that. So you see a lot of examples with 8 hours. So this is telling us what's happening in the first hour, second hour, and so on. Up here on this axis here, this is stage wake. So sometimes we refer to waking as a stage. And how you can tell how many times this particular person has woken up is because if you just scan across where wake is, you can see that there are a few points. And the longer the horizontal line, the longer they've been awake. Stage R is stage REM. And again, you can tell where REM is. If you scan across here, you can see how long each REM stage is. I'm going to talk about these circles in just a second. And then we go through stage non-REM 1, stage non-REM 2, stage non-REM 3. Fun fact, it used to be called stage 3 and 4, but now it's just collapsed into stage 3. And what I want to point out here is that non-REM sleep stages 1 and 2, especially 1, we don't spend much time in that. So at the beginning of the night, we maybe spend about 5 minutes, 4 minutes, if that. And this is a very light stage of sleep. So this is like if you're just nodding off and someone calls your name, you will wake up easily. Stage 2, we spend a little bit more time in stage 2, but it's still a fairly light sleep stage, but we do spend more time in non-REM stage 2. And then the last stage I talked about, remember stage 3, this is our deep sleep. And you can see how much time we spend in stage 3. And what I want to highlight here, why this is circled, is because the way that our sleep cycle works is that we spend a lot more time at the beginning of the night in our deep sleep. And at the end of our night, so towards the morning, we spend more time in REM and stage 2 somewhat. And that's important because the beginning of the night is maybe when we're getting some of our deepest sleep. And then the interesting thing about having REM at the end of our night is that if you've ever noticed when you wake up in the morning, you remember more of your dreams. This is maybe because we're more likely to be in REM when our alarm goes off or when we're awoken. So hopefully that is clear. And just so you all know, I cannot see this chat, so I'll rely on our host to let me know if I need to stop. Okay, so why do we sleep? It may or may not surprise you to know that we don't exactly know. A lot of time and research has gone into understanding, but we have some good ideas on why we need to sleep. It's actually, when you think about it, sleep is kind of a funny thing for us to do because if we think about our ancestors from way back, it's actually quite dangerous to go to sleep, right? You remember the definition I gave, perceptual disengagement. You won't know if some animal is creeping up on you, but that's how we know it's necessary, right? It's this very vulnerable position to be in. And so we know that it's necessary. So we think that part of why we sleep is that we know what happens when we don't sleep. And what happens when we do sleep is that it improves the quality of being awake. And that runs the gamut. Alertness, mood, thinking. If we don't sleep, those things become extremely difficult to do. And there's varying degrees, right? So some researchers study sleep deprivation totally and what that looks like. If you've ever had a sleepless night with a newborn, or you've been awake all night because of an emergency, you know what that feels like. But there's some other things that happen in our brain that we think we need sleep for. And one is integration of experience and learning. And the way they figure this out, sleep studies are really funny, but some ways that they figure out how much it matters for learning is they'll give people a list of words, and they'll say, and they're nonsense words, and they'll give two groups this list of words. And in one group, they'll say, I want you to rehearse this and then take a nap. And then the other group, there's no nap. And they realize that the group that has napped can learn this set of words better. That does not mean we all need naps, by the way, just to throw that out there. But we think that there's something that happens, the pruning that happens in our brain at night helps us integrate those experiences. We also think that brain cell repair happens at night. And in particular, another thing that happens, you may have heard of neurotransmitters. These are how thoughts and actions are firing in our brain. I won't say more than that. I'm not a brain person, but at night they become desensitized during the day. And so at night, we think that they can get resensitized so we can fire more quickly. And then lastly, well, not lastly, there's one more point here, but we also are learning that that we need to sleep for metabolic and inflammatory reasons, that sleeping helps reduce inflammation that we have, systemic inflammation that we have running through our body, and it helps with our metabolism. And then finally, we have pretty good evidence that consistent sleep is associated with longevity. So that's it in a nutshell. There's a lot of reasons why we think we sleep. But what happens if we don't sleep? Well, just take all of those and flip them on their head. But in particular, one thing that I think we're most familiar with is our mood is affected by sleep. This has been documented again and again and again. Even if it's not really conscious that this is happening, it's harder to feel good without sleep. And this is short term, right? So even in the short term, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. And then even in the short term, we might notice that our recall is not as good. It doesn't mean that we have memory problems. It just means that those synapses are not firing, those neurotransmitters are not firing as rapidly. And that's something we can see in the short term. And reaction times. There is evidence that when we don't sleep as well, and we don't get a lot of sleep, that our ability to respond is not as fast as when we get adequate sleep. Okay, so those are some short-term examples. There's many more, but those are some good examples of short-term. But in the long term, we are seeing more and more that we think that sleep over time is associated with cognitive functioning later in life. And that in particular, adequate sleep, and we can talk about what adequate sleep is, and I will, but that adequate sleep and consolidated sleep is associated with, over the long term, better cognitive functioning. There's other examples of long terms, but I'm just going to mention these. There's a lot of support also that adequate and sufficient sleep is associated with better cardiovascular functioning over the long term. And one of the ways that we see this relationship are with people who consistently sleep less than 6 hours a night. We see that they have higher incidence of cardiovascular disease than people who sleep more than that. We also see smaller associations for people who sleep more than 9 hours per night. So we see a little bit from really short, and then we also see that association for people who sleep longer than is average. So how does sleep happen? You know, we go through our day, we maybe aren't thinking much about sleep. And then somehow at the end of the night, if all goes well, this is a good thing. Your eyes feel heavy, you feel tired, and suddenly it becomes harder to maintain attention on something. And you get the feeling like, I need to go to sleep. I want to go to bed. Unless you're a kid, then maybe you don't get those feelings. But for the longest time, and it's still for the most part, still the case today. But we have learned that sleep is governed by two processes, and we call them process S and process C. And you'll see why. But I'm going to talk about a third process that we think has a lot to do with sleep as well, that hadn't really been explored until maybe the last 10 or 15 years. Okay, but first is what we call process S. And the best way to think about this is to think about an hourglass. What process S is that as soon as we are awake for the day in the morning, we build up propensity to sleep throughout the day. So we build up, we call it sleep propensity, you can call it sleep drive. But basically, when we wake up, it's the lowest it will be throughout the day. And then as we go throughout the day, it builds and builds and builds like an hourglass. So it's like we flipped over. And when it's full, that's when we should have the most sleep drive. And for most adults, for many adults, we need about 16 hours of wakefulness to build up that sleep drive. So 8 hours of sleep, 16 hours of wakefulness. There's obviously some, there's some wiggle room there, but in general, average. We need about 16 hours to build that wakefulness all the way up until we go to bed that night. But that's not the only thing that drives our sleep is wakefulness. What also drives how we sleep is the circadian clock, and basically night and day. Most people will sleep at night, and most people feel fatigued and in need of more sleep better when it is nighttime outside. There's also, for most people, or for a lot of people, a slight dip in the afternoon. And we see that pretty consistently. So this is another funny way they do research, is that they bring people into a lab and they hook them up and they have them there for a week at a time. And they measure when they're given opportunities for naps, when they're more likely to go to sleep. And the two times that come up the most frequently are between 4 and 6 a.m. but in the afternoon. So between 2 and 4 p.m. in the afternoon, less so. But so we know that there's something about night and day and the circadian clock that tells us when it's time to sleep. So if all goes well and everything is lined up, then you have your own internal clock that tells you, I feel sleepy now, I've been awake for 16 hours, and it corresponds to nighttime to me. However, what we're realizing is that there's one thing that can override both of these, and you probably have these experiences in your own life. You are sufficiently sleepy and it's nighttime, but there's something going on the next day, and that's what we call the alarm. And alarm is maybe too strong of a word because it could be something really exciting, going on vacation. If you celebrate Christmas, that's always kind of hard to sleep the night before, especially if you're a kid, but also if you have something going on, you're giving a big presentation at work, or you have a work trip, you're going to have to get up early. This alarm system that we have can override the sleep from the hourglass and the circadian clock. So it can override both of those things. So even when it's all working well, it tells your brain, oh, nope, this is not the time for sleep. And that's actually, there's a good reason for that. Like I mentioned, our ancestors long ago, they had to sleep. And if they had to sleep, even though it's vulnerable. But so what we have is if there is any kind of threat, our brain will tell us, nope, 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 don't go to sleep here. There's something going on. Even if it's not a life threat, it could be a psychological threat. It could be something that we're nervous about. Our brain takes that as a signal to not sleep as deeply, not sleep as long, or not fall asleep so easily. So those are the three processes. Process S, the amount of sleep you've had. Process C, circadian clock. So what is sleep health? There's been a movement, I would say, that's been building over the last 9 years or so to think of sleep not in terms of disorders. Now, I will talk about a couple of disorders, but to think of it as the elements that make up, ideal process S and process C, the elements that make up how do we feel good at night and how do we feel rested. And we think there are several components that lead to this. And the first one is regularity. And what we mean by regularity is we think that there is something important about going to sleep and waking up within an hour of the same time every day. So if you're an 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. kind of person, going to sleep between 10 and 12 and waking between 6 and 8 every day. So either within an hour earlier or an hour later. We think there's something really important about that. And it has a lot to do with the circadian part of our sleep process. That sends signals to keep us in sync. And then we think there's something really important about just feeling satisfied with your sleep. And I'll talk more about this, but when you wake up, if you've had adequate amount of sleep and you have sufficient opportunity for sleep, that you wake up feeling generally satisfied. Now, not necessarily the minute you wake up, there's something in our brains, and it varies from person to person, like how long it takes us to come online. But for the most part, when we don't feel satisfied, we start to wonder if something's wrong. Timing. Now, this also has to do with circadian, our internal circadian rhythm, but also just how everything else works on circadian clocks in our body. But we think that it's pretty important to be asleep or trying to sleep between 2 and 4 a.m. And you can probably already think of a million things that might be going wrong when you work night shifts, for example. But we think this particular time of night is pretty important to be asleep, or at least trying. And then probably the thing you hear about the most is duration. So what I have here is a scale. This graphic shows newborn all the way to older adult. And you can see, newborns need somewhere between 14 to 17 hours of sleep. They do not get that all in one sitting. If you've ever had a newborn, same with infants, quite a bit of sleep. And then it goes down from there to young adults and adults in this range needing somewhere, we think, between 7 to 9 hours. But it also could be appropriate for some to have around 6 to 10. And there's some exceptions, right? So most people need between 7 to 9. However, there is a small percentage of the population who are legitimately short sleepers. So you give them the most opportunity they can take, and they will sleep 5.5 to 6 hours a night. And there's just nothing that can be done about that. And then there is some of the population who just need a little bit more sleep. And again, nothing to be done about it. It doesn't mean there's something wrong. It's just a smaller percentage of the population. We think there might be a genetic component, but we don't know, or other people might know. I don't know. So that's generally where we want to be, is between 7 to 9 hours. And then as you see, you can, and into older adulthood, we think 7 to 8 is probably more appropriate, and that aiming for 9 is just not realistic. Okay. The next one that we think is pretty important for sleep health is what we call efficiency. And really what this means is, how efficient is it when you get into bed and go to sleep and try to sleep? Are you asleep for the whole time, or do you have a lot of wakefulness while you're in bed? We think the more efficient, the better. And then daytime alertness. So even though this is not a nighttime category, we think that the extent to which someone is alert during the day and can maintain wakefulness is pretty important for understanding sleep health and and for having good sleep health. So I'm going to talk about a few tips for improving sleep health. So keep in mind, as I talk about these are not things that I recommend for people who might have disorders, right? I mean, I might recommend some of them, but I think when you think about sleep health, it's just like, what's a few things that I could do to help? But maybe I don't have a sleep disorder. I don't have insomnia. I don't have another disorder. I just want to get the most out of my sleep. So the first thing is, which is really hard, and I'm starting with this because most of us will say, and this is in the literature too, most of us struggle with getting enough sleep. That's what the biggest complaint is. I don't get enough sleep. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And so the fix to that, easy fix, right, is to protect sleep hours. But I say protect sleep hours by focusing on just minutes. So even 15 minutes more. So saying to yourself, I'm not getting enough sleep. I've been getting 6.5 hours of sleep. I don't feel rested. I'm going to try to get 7.5. Start with just 15 minutes more. Backing up the bedtime just by 15 minutes, it can be helpful. But important to discuss this with the family, right? A lot of us, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us have commitments to other family members. We have commitments to our kids, our spouses. Even if they're not living with us, we have a lot of demands. And just making sure people know that this is your plan, and everyone getting on board in the house with this. We don't talk about that as sleep researchers, in my opinion, enough, that we don't sleep in a vacuum. We have a lot of other things going on. So making a point of talking about this, same way you would with like, hey, as a family, let's eat more vegetables, right? You might not just spring that on the family. And remember growing up when you would have a bedtime wind down routine, you would maybe read with your parent or have time set aside, and it became hopefully a quiet time to start to relax. We still need that as adults. We need a bedtime routine and we need wind down time. Now, the thing is, and I'm guilty of this too, is that there's a lot that can get our attention that isn't necessarily winding down. So, there's a reason I'm making this motion. This is one of them, right? Our phones. And so setting aside, I generally tell people about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes before you intend to go to bed for something calming. Could be reading, could be a wonderful show that doesn't get you riled up. Could be any of those things in dim lighting, just quiet time, podcast, a magazine, things like that. And because of process C, because of circadian rhythms, one of the most important things is a consistent wake time. So even if you have a night where you're out late, as much as possible, go to bed late, you can have a life, but try to maintain a wake up time within 1 hour. And the reason for that is both because of process S and process C. The longer you put off waking up the next morning, if you need 16 hours of wakefulness, it might drive that bedtime later. So this is something that can happen on the weekends, right? We stay up a little bit later. So Sunday night, when we try to go to bed at our normal 10:30 p.m. or whatever it is, we don't quite feel tired, and that can set us off for the whole week. using the bed for sleep only. This inevitably, I get a question about TVs at this point. If you don't have a sleep problem, I say it's fine. Don't tell the sleep world that I say that. But in general, you want it for a winding down time. So this means I think of this as like, don't bring work to bed. Try not to spend all day in bed, even though it can feel nice sometimes. And really, it helps to signal to your brain to be that the bed is for sleeping. Minimize naps. There is a way to nap, and if people have questions about that, I'm happy to share. But this especially, I mean, naps in the evening, and those little cat naps when we're watching a show. You can see this person's kind of stretched out. It looks like on a couch. I don't know, but yeah, we want to minimize that as much as we can, and reduce caffeine and alcohol. So let me start with caffeine. Caffeine is not problematic for most people in sufficient or recommended doses and after a certain time period. So I also teach undergraduates, and I remember this when I was that age, that I could have a coffee at like 10:30 p.m. and go to bed at midnight and have no issues. As we get older, it becomes harder to process that. Our receptors aren't as fast as processing the caffeine. So this is why generally the recommendation is try to limit caffeine after 12 or 1 or 2 p.m. You can test it on yourself and see like, okay, that was too late. But morning coffee, generally those effects will have burned off before bedtime. So not a big deal. Alcohol, on the other hand, the thing about it is, even though it's a depressant, so it can help you unwind and relax, which is why a lot of people like to have a glass of wine or a beer with dinner or some kind of alcoholic beverage. When we start to metabolize it about 4 hours after we drink it, it increases wakefulness. So you might notice if you had a couple of drinks, you are awake at 2 or 3 in the morning and you're like, what in the world? Why am I awake? A lot of times that has to do with you're starting to metabolize the alcohol that increases wakefulness. So pretty much all studies say that if you're struggling with sleep, if it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother you. But if there is something about your sleep you would like to improve and it's a little disjointed, then cutting down on alcohol in the evenings is probably a good idea. Okay. So I just talked about some ways to help sleep health, and I talked to you about regularity, satisfaction, timing, etc. But persistent and consistent sleep issues can indicate disorders. Not always, but they can. So, for example, I won't go through all of the sleep disorders, but here are some examples. If someone is feeling dissatisfied with their sleep, despite maybe getting adequate or what we might consider adequate sleep, a couple of the things we think about are insomnia. You might not be getting the most out of your sleep. The other one we think about, RLS, stands for restless leg syndrome. And the reason we think about that is because someone might be, there's another disorder also associated with movement called periodic limb movement. And sometimes when people come in and they're like, I'm sleeping 7 or 8 hours, however, I don't feel rested, and we hook them up and study them, we realize, oh, there's a lot of movement. So they're not getting a lot of that deep sleep that helps people feel rested. When you're not able to sleep between 2 and 4 a.m., one of the things that we obviously shift work disorder. So people who work shifts and are really struggling with their sleep, we call that shift work disorder. When efficiency is really poor, we think again of insomnia. And then one of the hallmarks of obstructive sleep apnea, and I'll talk a little bit more about apnea and insomnia, is limited daytime alertness. So having a hard time staying awake during the day. This happens, I no longer tell people I study sleep when I'm on a plane, but This has happened so many times when I'm on a flight and a person next to me says, oh, I can fall asleep anytime, anywhere, any time of day. And I think, oh, I don't know that that's a good thing. And then they fall asleep, and then within 20 minutes they're snoring loudly. And I think, oh no, maybe you have apnea. You should probably get checked out. So with daytime alertness, especially, of course, there's a lot of overlap here. With insomnia, you can have difficulty being asleep between 2 and 4. You can get insufficient duration, all of that, but just some examples of what we're looking for. So I'm going to focus on the 2 most common disorders. I've already said them a couple of times, but I'm happy to field questions if I can about other disorders. But one of the most common sleep disorders is insomnia. And specifically what insomnia is an opportunity for sleep. So you have sleep opportunity. This isn't that, your work schedule is such that you can't sleep at night, or you have children and you can't sleep at night, but you have the opportunity, but it's insufficient. You're not getting it, or it's unsatisfactory, or both. And this affects about 10 to 30% of the population. And, but one thing to know about insomnia is that a diagnosis of insomnia does not require a sleep study. So you could go see a sleep specialist and they will more than likely not give you a sleep study to confirm that you have insomnia. We can get that from a clinical interview and maybe some questionnaires. Insomnia treatment. So how we treat insomnia. We use something called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. If you're in the mental health world at all, or you've sought a therapist yourself, you may have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. But what's different about this cognitive behavioral therapy, is why I've capitalized behavioral, it's more focused on behaviors. And I tell people this because sometimes they think, I don't want to go see a psychologist for a sleep problem. Like, this seems like a medical problem. And it's approached more medically than psychological, if that helps at all. And by that, I mean, we focus more on behaviors. And we focus on the behaviors that will maximize the hourglass and the circadian clock and reduce the amount of alarm. A lot of times with insomnia, it becomes a disorder of hypervigilance. So we work on reducing that as much as we can. You usually do sleep logs. So you keep a sleep diary and track your sleep. That's a best practice for insomnia treatment. And most of the time, not every single time, but most of the time, you can make sufficient progress and get help within 6 to 8 sessions. So very quick treatment. There's another treatment I can talk about that I have some expertise in too, which is brief behavioral treatment. And this is where you talk about 1 to 2 sessions of trying to help people who are having insomnia symptoms. So this isn't going to therapy for, months and months to get to help with a sleep problem. It's designed to be quick and efficient. Prescriptions are, if you are to see a sleep specialist, let me say, prescriptions are unlikely because they're just not indicated for long-term use, and especially not for older adults. But some cognitive behavioral therapy providers can help facilitate with tapering. So many, many times I've seen patients, my students see patients who really want to stop taking Ambien, Lunesta, et cetera. And we can work with them on tapering down while helping with other ways. Okay. And the other most common sleep disorder is obstructive sleep apnea. And you'll see why it's common in just a second. I'll tell you how prevalent it is. The symptoms of this, so you do need to be diagnosed with sleep apnea, but the symptoms can include snoring and pausing and breathing. So when we hook people up to measure them, we see something like this, where their airflow stops, their chest does not move as much, and their abdomen is not moving as much. That means there's those like that. And I've heard people do it. You may have heard people do it. Snoring is also a hallmark of that. Unrefreshing sleep despite opportunities. So someone might sleep 8 hours, but then they're falling asleep, later, and just given a couple of minutes, then they'll fall asleep. A lot of daytime sleepiness. However, it can be masked, it can be disguised by caffeine. So sometimes, because of all the sleepiness, I don't blame people, they will, drink more iced tea, they'll drink more coffee, they'll drink more soda, because they are so sleepy and they really need to stay awake. So sometimes they might not realize how sleepy they are, though, because it can be masked. So that's just something to be aware of. Another thing, and this can present more in women than men, or just as much, but there's a feeling of, women will sometimes say, it feels like I'm choking, or I have a dream where I'm choking and I can't breathe. And so when my alarm bells go off, and I think I need to refer this person. And then coughing, not just coughing because you have a cold, but sleeping and then all of a sudden start coughing. This affects, depending on the study you read, 8 to 20% of middle-aged adults. And this particular statistic is for, not medium, I'm blanking on the word right now, moderate OSA. So I didn't even put in here the mild apnea. However, 40 to 50% of older adults can have moderate obstructive sleep apnea. So pretty common. You have to be diagnosed by a physician, and you have to have a sleep study. However, a lot more sleep physicians are able to do home studies. So sometimes that's a impediment, is to come in and sleep overnight. A lot of people don't want to do that, but more and more places can do a home study. They'll send you home, or they'll have someone come out to your home and hook you up. The most common treatment and the most effective treatment, there are surgeries, yes, but the most common treatment is continuous positive airway pressure. That's CPAP. And you may have heard of this, and sometimes this is why people don't want to have sleep apnea, because it involves sleeping with some kind of a mask. But I'm highlighting for you a couple of, we have, back in the day, it was a much bigger contraption, but it's come a long way with being able to maybe just have the nose and not the mouth, and varying degrees of how it is secured to your head. And it is a transition. I'm not going to lie. It is a transition. However, it is a transition that, once it works well, people cannot believe how much better they feel, that they're actually getting sufficient sleep. And by the way the CPAP works is, remember I said when we fall asleep, we lose muscle tone. So part of that is that because of the weight, it becomes harder to breathe. So what this does is continuous pressure helps keep the airways open throughout the night. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up so we have time for questions, and just say my recommendation is this. If sleep problems persist and there are daytime consequences, so there are things that you're missing out on in life, or you're not enjoying in life as much as you can, seek out a sleep specialist. And we do have them in Tuscaloosa, and definitely also in Birmingham. For many individuals, though, fine-tuning is sufficient. If you don't have a sleep disorder, but maybe you just want to get a little bit more out of your sleep, you want it to be easier to wake up in the morning, you can use some of those recommendations that I gave to fine-tune, maybe have consistent wake times, consistent bedtimes. Eliminate that 5 o'clock nap sitting on the couch. If you're wanting to fine-tune. And with that, I will take some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take some questions about sleep now too. So let me just stop that. Back here.
Heather, can you go over a little bit about healthy napping?
Yes. I'm sorry. because of the way this is working, I can't tell who's asking that, but yes. How do you nap correctly? Okay. So sometimes we have a life such that we cannot get the amount of sleep we need at night. And we just have to, I'm thinking of when I had an infant, right? And we need to incorporate naps. Most naps, I would say, should not be within 7 hours of bedtime. So just count backwards. If you want to incorporate a nap, if you're in between shifts, you have 2 jobs, how you have to manage it. And I've done this with patients. We carve out a time of their day that they can take a quick 30 or 45-minute nap, and that would be it, no longer than that. And the reason for that, there's a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that, remember how I talked about your sleep drive builds and builds and builds and builds throughout the day. If you nap, you're cutting into that. So it depends on how sleep deprived you are. If you need that nap, and sometimes, we're that sleep deprived, it doesn't matter. I can nap for an hour and then I can go to bed that night just fine. But that's something to keep in mind, is that you are dipping into that sleep drive. But if you can do it not within 7 hours of bedtime, and you can make it, I would say, honestly, no 30 to 45, no more than that, then you should be pretty good to build up enough sleep drive for that night.
For anybody, you can just put your questions in the chat if you want, or use the Q&A box, and I can definitely get those to her. Okay, so here's a question from Carolyn. What if you wake up an hour or 2 before you really wake up to take medication? Is that healthy?
It's hard to know, because I don't know the reason, and I don't need to know the reason for the medication. I'm not a physician that way, but sometimes there are things that wake you up. I think this question is also about two things. One, should I go back to sleep? I don't know if that's part of the question. I think all of us wake up. So I think one of the things I try to tell people is have realistic expectation. Like, it's normal to wake up a couple of times a night. And especially the older we get, it just becomes harder to have that solid, kid sleep that's 10 to 12 hours. So expect that you might be awake. If you have to wake up and take something, I would make it as easy as possible, no lights, and then I would try to go right back to sleep. So have it right next to your bed, make it as that you just had to get up to use the restroom and then go back to bed. If you're waking up an hour or 2 before you want to wake up and you have to stay awake, now that is a little bit different. And if I had to work with someone who had that going on and it was for an extended period of time, it wasn't just time limited, I would say we should start shifting so you're going to bed earlier, so that you feel more awake if you have to stay awake at that time, so it doesn't feel out of sync with your internal clock. Because that's something I probably didn't say. There's so much about sleep, but that I could say is that you can shift your clock. You always have the endogenous rhythm that you are born with, but you can shift it with light usually and consistency. So if you had to go for an extended period of time where you need to wake up, let's say your normal wake up time is 7 and you need to wake up at 5 for 4 weeks at a time, you can work on shifting your clock so that you feel more alert and awake at that time. If you're waking up just really quickly, again, low lights, make it so easy so that you can just go right back to sleep. Is it bad to use the snooze button on your alarm clock? I wonder if my husband planted that question. Is it bad? Let me let you answer this for yourself. If you are having to use your snooze multiple times, it probably means that you're not getting sufficient sleep, because you're not feeling ready to wake when the signal goes off to wake up, right? So I wouldn't say it's bad in terms of you're ruining your day or anything, but something to consider is that every time you wake up, it takes time to go back to the deeper stages of sleep. And in the morning, that means more REM or less REM. And so what you're doing is making your brain keep waking up and going back to sleep, when maybe you could be getting consolidated sleep instead, if that makes sense. So if you needed to be up at 7 and your alarm clock starts at 6, that means that hour from 6 to 7, you're not having consolidated sleep. And most of the time, consolidated is better. I know people say, I like to have it so it wakes me up. I feel like I'm waking up more. And you are. I would say you're probably better off waking at 6:30. See if you can get yourself out of bed to a bright window and sit there for like 20 minutes to get your brain to come online. Is there an optimal time to take a shower before bed? No. And actually, some people say, I think it all just depends on what feels wakeful for you. Some people say that, well, one of the ways that our body prepares for sleep is by reducing its temperature. So if you take a really hot shower, it seems like, oh, maybe that will wake me up. But coming out of the shower, actually, your body starts to feel cold. So some people find that very comforting to do that. So I don't think there's an optimal time for showering. I don't think anyone studied that. I wake up every morning at 3 and can't go back to sleep, regardless of how early or late I go to bed. I'm always awake at 3. So I can't tell you what to do with that, except if that's something that's affecting you, I would see a sleep person about that. They can maybe help shift your sleep for longer periods of time. Beverly's question, what are the symptoms of narcolepsy? So, I thought about this when I put daytime sleepiness, because that is a symptom of OSA. Narcolepsy is much less common than OSA, but it is similar, having a really hard time with wakefulness, no matter how much sleep you get. So one of the first things, if you come into a sleep center and they ask you about that, they will probably do a sleep study to rule out narcolepsy or rule out OSA. But one type of narcolepsy that's even less common than narcolepsy is something called, oh God, I just blanked on the name. Narcolepsy with catatonia, which is strong emotions and then falling asleep. So that is not, you don't see that with OSA at all. So that sleepiness, maybe some of that like strong emotion and then falling asleep. And it looks like Matthew also has a question similar to Natasha's. I wake up every morning at 4, regardless of whenever I go to bed. What should I do? So similar to Natasha, the first thing I would look at if I were a provider and you're coming in, first we would do a whole history. So there would be that. But the first thing I would look at is the timing, the consistency in timing. So we'd probably give you sleep logs and have you fill those out. And see if there's some way we can push on the nighttime a little bit and then help you get through that 4 a.m. Or 3 a.m. wake up. But yeah, that usually requires a little more, I think, more than fine tuning and some experimenting with your sleep with a provider, I think would be helpful. And James says, any suggestions for managing sleep with a newborn, particularly starting to fall asleep and then getting woken up for very short periods, creating significant grogginess? Oh man, newborn is just so hard. It's just rough. If you can incorporate a nap, I would incorporate a nap. And I would try to do it more in the morning. And how you manage it, it's just rough. It's a rough time. One thing that I did, I don't know if this is helpful. By the way, there's no book on this, right? But one thing that I did is, because I knew I was going to be waking up a lot, I just went to bed. It was the only time in my life I've gone to bed at 7 p.m. and I was probably in bed until 7 a.m. But throughout that whole period, I would probably get close to 7 hours of sleep. It was broken up and I was tired, but it was easier to manage than, trying to just get 8 hours of broken sleep. So, and then in those cases too, I would probably say, try taking a mid-morning nap if you have that flexibility, if you have to be at work. I know that's hard, and see if that helps at all. The other thing is, for newborns and families, it can help if you have someone who can relieve, one of you can relieve each other, like you just stay up longer. I went to help a friend when she had twins, and we just took shifts for a little while so that one person at least would get like a stretch of 4 to 5 hours, which felt amazing after not getting that. Chronic pain cause you to want to sleep more? That's an interesting question. And one of the things that I always ask patients, and I train my students to do, is make sure you're understanding for yourself what if you feel sleepy or fatigued. Because there's an interesting relationship between chronic pain and sleep. And sleepy is your eyes are heavy, you can't focus, and you can fall asleep at any moment, that lovely feeling of like, I'm about to nod off. Fatigue is different, right? Your brain feels tired, your body feels tired, but you're not necessarily ready for sleep. So Amber, I don't know the answer to that question. I think managing it can make it more difficult for sure. And maybe your body's working harder. But I will say that more common, or really common with chronic fatigue, is to also feel, or chronic pain is also to feel chronically fatigued. You're welcome. Any other questions? It's saying my internet is unstable, so hopefully I'm coming across okay.
Oh yeah, you are.
Okay.
That's great. This has been wonderful. These are really good questions. I love to see that people are having specific questions they want answered.
Yeah. I'm happy to. It's like I can do this in my sleep.
Okay, well, I think if anyone is there, so you mentioned the clinic that your students that
Technology department has. Yeah,
is that available for anyone?
So this is a community clinic that we just have a partnership with, and his name is James Geyer, Dr. Jim Geyer, or Dr. James Geyer, GE. I'm going to put it in the chat. And he is asleep. It's Tuscaloosa. Now, of course, I can't remember. Sleep and neurobiology, I think. Sleep and neurology. That's what it is. Sleep and neurology. So there's also a couple of providers at UAB. So if people live in Birmingham too, they have great sleep psychologists there. So
we've got one last one that came in. The question is from Leslie: should you stay off of your cell phone for a certain time before bed?
I think what I would recommend is, if you're noticing, and if you're like, hey, I feel like my sleep isn't exactly where I want it to be, that's one, I say easy fix, but we all know how hard that is. But yes, I would say thank you. Thank you, Brittany, for that. Yeah, I think it is good to stay off your phone. It's not just the light. There's settings now you can change the light. I didn't get into this, but there are certain light spectrum that keep you more awake. But right now, a cell phone is basically like a computer. So it's kind of like having this whole computer with the amount of social media, the work email that's on there, the rabbit hole you can go down in the news, and all of that. So I recommend, if people can, to limit that in the evening, especially if you're noticing it's harder for you to fall asleep. It's one of those that you can help. Do blue light glasses help with being on your phone before bed? You know what, David, I haven't caught up on this literature. Theoretically, but for all the reasons I just mentioned, if you're reading a book, maybe but the things we do on our cell phone, that's enough to increase alarm. And I don't even mean alarm like as in I'm super stressed out, just alarm in terms of engagement, how much we're task switching, going from one thing to another. That's a lot on our brain. And that is counterproductive for sleep, that whole process. So it could potentially help with light if all you're doing is something like reading. I know sometimes I have a book on my phone, especially when I travel. But as far as like, I don't think it won't do anything about the other things that are getting our attention that really get our brain going. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Any last questions? I think we're at the hour, but I have a couple of minutes. I don't know if you do though.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, okay. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This has been great. And I'll go ahead and I'll be uploading this recording onto our website. So if anyone wants to rewatch it or share it with somebody else, a coworker that couldn't attend, then feel free to do so.
All right. Thank you. Thanks
so much,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.